topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the hosts and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
Well, good afternoon. Welcome to Bill Martinez and our show. Thank you for sharing a part of your day and listening up to what we have to share with you right now, as the question remains on the minds of many Americans, like what has happened to our country? It's like it's slipping through our fingers and with such rapidity, right? I mean, just in a matter of years, not even decades, it just seems that we're losing almost on a daily basis more of our liberties and more of the constitutional republic, which next week we're going to be celebrating Constitutional Day, right? A time for us to get together and probably reintroduce ourselves to those tenets and the values that started this great American idea. Well, the ideological left, no doubt, is transforming America into something other than what our founding fathers had intended. You remember our national motto, e pluribus unum, no longer means out of many one, but has been replaced with ex una multi, out of one many. In divided America, it means identity consciousness reigns as we become polarized by calls for diversity, equity, and inclusion. That radical view is echoed by the intimidated business world, most media, the corrupted educational establishment, and especially the deep state, big government. In Divided We Stand, the author, Bob Maginnis, the former Army Lt Col, reveals this insidious agenda and explores where it intends to take America and accelerate steps to the prophetic end times. Bob Maginnis, welcome to the show. Good to have you with us, sir.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
In your book, Divided We Stand, the Globalist Scheme for a One World Government, what motivated you? Why did you have to write this book, Bob?
Well, I felt that a country was spinning out of control. And as a result, Bill, I said, look, I've been watching the culture for decades. I wrote a book, The Deeper State. I wrote a book, Give Me Liberty, Not Marxism. And I just saw this cultural revolution coming to this country in a way that was trying to transform our entire society. And having, spent a little bit of time, in Hong Kong during the Cultural Revolution, I had bits and pieces of what that meant for that country. And it was a radical transformation, really the killing of 100 million people and the transformation of all the major institutions under the leadership of Mao Zedong. And of course, studying history, you see that the French Revolution just turned that country upside down. It was a cultural revolution, not unlike what we're seeing attacking the very institutions of America today. So that's a bit of background. I'm very concerned about the direction we're going, and it's my prayer that we'll get some good leadership here and begin to turn this around.
Exactly. Well, it starts with we the people, Bob. I mean, we the people have the government we've allowed to, give rise in our country and to limit our liberties. Your books that you had mentioned were quite prescient. I mean, you saw what was happening on the horizon. You saw this coming and you sent out a warning. I mean, you're like the watchman on the wall whose duty is to warn people, and you've warned us.
Yeah, well, that certainly was how I saw it, Bill. As I saw it working in government for well over 50 years now, I see, how the administrative state and how, quite frankly, when I talk about the deeper state, I'm talking about the spiritual aspects of what goes on in Washington and how certain people are taken captive, not just by the Chinese or the Russians or some of our enemies, but, the spiritual components to what goes on in Washington. And even before I was in Washington, my own mother worked in the Ford White House, worked on Capitol Hill. And I had contacts throughout the city that demonstrated to me that we were in deep trouble. We needed godly leadership. We needed leadership that understood what our founders had in mind.
Exactly.
And we needed the consent of the people to direct what was going on in Washington, and not a bunch of wayward, evil miscreants, as I've seen it over the years.
Mm-hmm. Bob, you were probably one of the earliest ones to call out the deep state. You knew that this bureaucratic enclave of unelected officials were, slowly but surely marching through progressively through the institutions, but particularly our government. That had already started back at the turn of the century with education, and they had quite the stranglehold. So by, the mid 50s, here they were able to, excuse me, they were able to take the 10 Commandments out of the hallways of our educational institutions. And then it was just a matter of time before they were able to fully take over, to the point now that we have books that are made available to young kids that we never thought in a million years would ever be possible. They're just absolutely disgusting. And parents, when they go to school board meetings and read excerpts of the books, the parents are told not to read it out loud. Well, wait a minute. You're exposing my kids to this, and yet at a board meeting with adults and the people who have approved this curriculum and these books to be in the school libraries, you don't want to hear what our kids are being exposed to? What hypocrisy.
Yeah, it is. We've gone full circle, or almost there. We started off in this nation, with homeschooling. And, Abraham Lincoln, learned how to read and write at his mother's knee. Even George Washington was taught, by his parents predominantly down in Fredericksburg, but he picked up some other things on the side. The reality is that we transition, and as you indicated, especially with the progressive movement in the late 1800s, we began to take over the education establishment. And then when John Dewey came in the 30s, he just radically transformed education and really put government in charge of the rearing of children. And it was also in the 1930s that John Dewey, got a pocket full of money from rich Rockefellers, and he brought over all the Marxists out of the 1968 Frankfurt School and sent them into journalism courses and to Hollywood and elsewhere, and they began to pollute not only the education establishment, but also the journalism and media establishment.
Entertainment, yeah, exactly.
And they came over, and by their own statements, these Marxists, interestingly, who were Jews fleeing Nazi Germany, had every intention of destroying America, imploding America. It reminds me certainly of what the Russians tried to accomplish themselves when Nikita Khrushchev in 1956, pulled off his shoe and, hit the podium at the UN and said, America's going to destroy itself from within. And precisely that's what we're beginning to see with Marxism creeping into education, into media, trying to establish itself firmly in government, and then to take over through socialistic and Marxist ways our entire country. And we've got to push back and push back hard.
Well, Bob, we have to reclaim our birthright. I mean, our citizenship of this great American idea is part of our birthright. And of course, it's clearly enumerated. I mean, you can say in a sense, our Constitution is our birth certificate, isn't it?
It really is. The Constitution, was written in blood, quite frankly, during the Revolutionary War. And those authors understood what was at stake here. They wanted to put the consent of God, of what was going on, in the hands of the people and have them direct their representatives as to how things should happen. And it wasn't a mistake that we had those first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, that guaranteed our liberties of speech, of religion, to bear arms, and so forth. And yet we're beginning to see those very liberties being robbed from us by a totalitarian government that seems to think that they're really in charge, and they've really flushed the whole idea of the consent of the people.
Without a doubt. We're talking with Bob Maginnis, author of the book, Divided We Stand, the Globalist Scheme for a One World Government. And you need to understand this one world government doesn't include the United States of America. They want the United States of America to be absorbed within this greater idea of governance, right?
Oh, there's no question about it. It's the globalists that would ship our jobs overseas, much like they have to the Chinese, would use the income of this country to foster some of the radical views, whether it's climate horrors or it's some other miscreant transsexual ideas perpetrated on the population. These are things that the likes of President Xi of Beijing has announced that he has every intention of reclaiming the rightful place of the Middle Kingdom, the Chinese people. And of course, this is payback for what the West did to them in the 1850s to 1860s with the Opium War, and of course the shipment of fentanyl into this country to kill hundreds of thousands of Americans is part of that payback, but it's only part of it, because not only do they rob us blind of intellectual property, they steal our weapon systems, they buy our politicians to get their way. And, unless we really, turn back the page to where we came from as a nation, I don't see that we have a lot of hope.
No, you're exactly right, Bob, because you know this, having been in the military, your experience in life is that when things go wrong, you've got to hit the pause button and think, okay, where did we get it wrong? Where did we make the wrong turn? How do we need to course correct? Because that's what prudent people do, successful people do, when they're constantly evaluating and making adjustments based on wrong turns along the way, because that's just natural. It's going to happen, right? But if you don't course correct, then you're going to become victimized.
No question about it. Certainly, the idea that government is the answer to all our problems. You can go back to LBJ when, we had the war on poverty. What did he do? Yeah. He basically made, split up many poor families and sent off the husbands and made the mothers and children dependent upon government. And that has continued through many, many decades. And it's really destroying the American family, which has always been kind of the building block of a great nation. Every founder of nations across the world understand that you need a mother, a father, and children to work together to pay the taxes, to become educated, to get jobs, and so forth. And yet, that very building block of society is something that our big government is trying to destroy.
Well, they absolutely did. I mean, look at I was talking with Bob Woodson last year about this very fact, Bob, that, Woodson, of course, from the Woodson Center. And, I said, Bob, we've spent, I don't know, 25, maybe even $30 trillion in the war on poverty since 1964. We've hardly moved the needle for all that money that we've invested. I said, where did the money go? And it was all to buy votes. And because that was Lyndon Baines Johnson, that's what he told the Southern Democrats, said they look at, if we give them this money, we're going to have, he referred to them in the N-word. He says, we'll have them voting Democrat for the next 100 years. Yeah.
The Democratic Party, of course, 1868 formed the KKK, and hasn't been, very apologetic about such a tragedy on this nation after the Civil War that cost us 630,000 American lives, about 2% at the time. The destruction of the family, the destruction of the marriage, and the watering down of the importance of marriage, and also the value we place on life.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I'm pro-life, and yet 40% of African American children die in the womb because of these bankrupt policies. Now, I know people are going to disagree on abortion policy, but 40% of an entire race in a country is destroyed in the womb. That seems to be not only a tragedy, that's genocide as far as I'm concerned.
It was planned. That's the way Margaret Sanger, the eugenicist, they planned it out that way. They got the net result. And it's beyond me that minorities will continue to support a party that continues to target their children in the womb. I mean, the other day, Kamala Harris, the vice president, was kind of upset that people were saying the Democratic Party was the party of abortion, that she felt that wasn't true. And the question was asked, well, when do you say that, what is the date? Is it 15 weeks? Is it 25 weeks, 30 weeks? She refused to answer, because we know what the Democratic Party stands for. It doesn't stand for life, and especially when it comes to minorities.
Yeah, I know our governor, our former governor here in Virginia, North,
Yes.
he famously said, even after the birth of the baby,
Exactly.
the mother and the physician can sit down there and discuss whether or not to keep it alive.
Yeah, we're gonna give a comfort care. Remember, he said comfort care.
These people are so radical. That Margaret Sanger was a progressive, just like John Dewey, just like others that have ruined the very institutions that our founders had every intention of preserving. And they violate our civil liberties. They want us to go in directions that are just contrary to certainly what the God that I worship would have us go. But that's not surprising. They are doing and using government in such a way today that it's destroying, and not only those freedoms, but it's putting in place a very frightening type of governance that is almost like what we see in places like the Republic of China. We see it in the former totalitarian Russia that's becoming more like that every day. And we don't need that, nor do we want that. But yet, government is overbearing. Government is trying to take over, the civil liberties and the independence that we once enjoyed as Americans.
Well, life is so foundational to the ethos of this great American idea. If you abuse and disrespect that, then there is a price to be paid. I've maintained, Bob, is that especially since the reversal of Roe v. Wade, and we can be grateful, to Donald Trump for this, and that is for him seating 3 Supreme Court justices that voted for life and turned back Roe v. Wade back to the states. From the very beginning, it was never to be a government issue. Remember, they always told us, no, we're not going to use taxpayer money to pay for abortions. Well, that's a big lie. They've been doing that. And I say, even for the Republican Party to pick up the argument, I say, look, it's back in the states. To me, this is a personal decision. If a woman and the husband or the father and the doctor want to make the decision, that's between them. I don't want to get into their business. I'm sorry that they're contemplating something as fatal as an abortion. But today, thank God for all these other centers, these pregnancy centers that are about, Bob, and offering alternatives, for adoption. I mean, we've got hundreds of thousands of Americans standing in line wanting to adopt children, and people are disrespecting life so pell-mell and so callous and matter of fact that a society cannot continue with this type of disrespect on its children.
Yeah, if you destroy your next generation, how are you going to preserve the country that you have? The destruction of the family, the manipulation of children by government, the manipulation of what is right or wrong, what our language is by our mass media, all of these, plus the attack on the freedom of worship, and shutting down places of worship during COVID-19, but allowing strip clubs and bars to continue to operate just doesn't make any sense. I know our founders would vigorously have objected had somebody even attempted to argue that was the right thing to do, and yet it's the leftists and these neo-Marxists that are pushing these agendas that are so corrupted and trying to destroy this great nation.
Yeah, I think our founding fathers would probably say the same thing that God said to Israel. Who told you to do such a thing? I would never imagine to ever ask you to sacrifice your children in the hot fires of Baal and Molech. Yeah. I mean, and this is where we are. But as we continue, as you say in your book, Divided We Stand, this scheme for a one world government, Bob, forget about our idea of humanity and liberty. At that point, under the globalist scheme, we're chattel. We're meaningless, aren't we?
Well, we certainly are, and they could care less. Like they're trying to force the Dutch to eat bugs, literally,
right.
rather than good food. And they're trying to rob us of the electronic devices that keep us alive, air conditioners and and other apparati that we have in our homes, in the name of climate change. These things are totally unacceptable, but it's being allowed. Unfortunately, I think to a certain degree, even by both parties. Our founders, especially James Madison, was opposed to having just two parties in this country because he says eventually they'll both be corrupted. I am concerned about that. I'd like to see a lot more pluralism than we currently have to give people choices. And that's an option that I certainly explore in Divided We Stand, because I think pluralism is helpful. I've seen it lived out in certain countries in Europe. They didn't do it perfectly, but the trend that we see in this country isn't all that favorable. But you mentioned, the kind of the globalists, the Klaus Schwabs of the world.
Exactly.
The World Economic Forum and the people that, gather annually in Switzerland to consider our future. They see themselves as godlike people, like George Soros calls himself God. And they see that they're going to stipulate what the world is going to become. They can fly off in their jets and they can eat whatever they want and live in these giant houses, like a former vice president that comes to mind, Vice President Gore. He has houses there in California, he has houses in Tennessee and in Virginia and elsewhere. But these people are such hypocrites that they don't even appreciate how they look to the rest of America, much less to the world. But globalism is what they have in mind. They want us to be obedient. They want us to take the shots they tell us we have to take to eat what we have to eat, live where they want us to live, and they're going to educate us and our children to the point that we're good, obedient plebeians. And I don't want that. And I don't think our founders want it, and I don't believe most Americans want it. But yet today we find that we are divided almost in half. And we haven't seen such division since the American Civil War. And, at that point in 1860, right before we went to arms, and because of the charge there in Charleston Bay that Lincoln called up the militia and the war started, we were divided about, of course, at that point, slavery. But today we're divided about ideology, about who's in charge, about the direction of this country. And unfortunately, much of the leftists especially, who are, albeit Marxists and certainly socialists as a minimum, want to drag this country in a way that our founders never had envisioned. And certainly I don't think those of us on the right have any ambition to go their way. We want to return to the good old days if that were possible to recover.
What trumps freedom, Bob? I mean, think about that. Once you've had a taste of freedom, why would you want to give that up? I mean, we got billions of people wanting to come into this country for this idea of freedom and that shining light on a hill. I have faith. I mean, it's easy to get discouraged, and I get that. With what's happening in our country, because people are ignorant of our Constitution. They're ignorant of our liberty. But I still believe that experience defines preference. And like defying the law of gravity, you can continue to do that, and you find out that it hurts. It's very painful. And maybe the next time, eventually, you'll make better decisions. And here we are. We've had an entitled generation that has been indoctrinated by these progressives that are leading them down the yellow brick road to nowhere and to imprisonment, because they will be, as Klaus Schwab is famous for saying, by the year 2030 is his vision, that you will own nothing and you will like it.
Yeah. It's partly the brainwashing that we saw during the Chinese Cultural Revolution. The Red Guard ran around, if you weren't obedient, if you didn't say the right, for our purposes, the right pronouns and salute the right people, then you either ended up in jail, or some concentration camp, or something worse. 100 million, arguably died. The fact that we have the left that is allowing crime to get out of control in our major cities. We have an open border that is just bleeding all sorts of people that seek the American life, but at the same time, they're robbing from those of us that are here, the life that we're slowly losing as a direct result of this infiltration through the southern border. And then, of course, these leftist policies that of overspending, destroying the dollar, not taking advantage of our natural resources, the carbon that is below our surface that could fuel our economy. They have such bizarre ideas that are undermining the very prosperity and the very direction that our forefathers and most of us, certainly on the right, have envisioned for this country.
Bob, how can they, in any kind of conscience, not see that they're hurting everyday Americans? Right now, I mean, you've got at least 50% of the country in dire straits. They're hurting severely. And the number one reason is because of the policies that have been enacted by this president. I mean, to take away our energy independence, to double the price of our gasoline. And look what he's done with, Bidenomics and inflation at every turn. And then he wants to tell us that it's working.
Yeah.
I don't know for who.
I don't either. I just don't see that it's rational. And perhaps that's part of the purpose. Those that are really pulling the strings of the puppet, Mr. Biden in this case, who can't really seem to think straight and speak two coherent sentences. Those people are doing the bidding and telling him what to say on the cards that they give him when he stands before the press. So, we have Bidenomics, which is destroying the dollar, Bidenomics that is really bringing hunger to a large section of this country, making housing unaffordable for many people. And then, of course, at the gas tank, all of us are reminded every time we go there on
exactly
basis how hard this is. And it's absolutely preventable, unnecessary. And yet they're pushing this climate agenda that is not based on true science, but it's based on radicalism. And that radicalism, much like all the things they've pushed over the years, is going in a direction that is not favoring the best interests of this country.
They need to be held accountable, Bob, because they've spent over $5 trillion of the people's money on this boondoggle. I mean, this is like Don Quixote fighting windmills, in my humble opinion. There's no science. I mean, you've got noted scientists, and 2 Nobel Prize scientists as well that are part of this latest signing on of saying there's no such thing as climate change as being presented by these radicals.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, they've captured such a large swath of the left that they're beating the drums in the direction that they want them to go. And so, whoever you believe, the Wall Street Journal says we're about 90% of the people agree we're going in the wrong direction. Right. We're deeply divided. Right. And then we're on the wrong track. Interestingly, almost 75% say that, the guy in the White House is too old to serve anymore. He doesn't seem to have the energy, much less the mental stamina and agility to do the sophisticated job that we require of a president going forward. So all of these issues, just resonate, I think, when people start to get serious about the direction and whether or not they're better off today than they were 3-4 years ago. I think, even those that are, truly trying to be objective can't come to any other conclusion that these people have sunk us into such a hole that we're not sure how we're going to get out.
Well, and that's the thing. I mean, we've got 2 more years of this kind of ridiculous lack of leadership, I guess. I mean, you can fill in any adjective you want. It's not good.
No, it's not. And we're certainly hopeful that the Republican Congress, though it's a slim majority, can at least create enough obstacles in the way of this administration to prevent more of this radicalism from maturing. But what I'm concerned about, Bill, is that our enemies have been watching us so intently.
Oh, absolutely.
And as a direct result of major missteps, whether in Afghanistan or in our southern border, or the economic decisions by this administration, and at that time by the Democratic Congress, that we end up in a dire situation that invites aggression. I believe directly that Vladimir Putin never would have attacked in Ukraine had we had a different administration and not had the debacle in Afghanistan, which demonstrated our weakness. I believe the Chinese are testing us left and right today and are licking their chops at the potential of taking over much of who we are, either directly or indirectly. So these are dire situations, and yet this administration seems to be totally AWOL when it comes to understanding the ways of this world and the direction that we ought to go, and not this corrupted direction that we're currently on.
Well, as a former Army Lieutenant Colonel, you know this, Bob. You know that strength needs to be projected. And if you project weakness, then you've got Russia taking over Crimea. You get Russia, invading Ukraine. You get China, taking over and militarizing the South China Seas. Kim Jong-un is firing missiles. He's testing missiles with a nuclear warhead potentially. That was very successful a couple of days ago. I mean, at every turn, look at Iran. I mean, Barack Obama insisted, after sending pallets of unmarked money, to Iran, that they would never go nuclear. Well, we knew that was a lie from the get-go, and here they are at any moment. And Israel cannot stand for that, Bob. And they're going to have to do something of a unilateral nature to make sure that Iran does not go nuclear. And so then what happens to the stability or the lack of stability in the Middle East at that point?
Yeah. They certainly, with the Chinese being nice to the Saudis, and the Saudis having been stiff-armed by the Biden people, that makes the Middle East with an Iran that is likely to become nuclear. Certainly, they're only steps away from that. We know how much enriched uranium they likely have, and that they've had the plans from the PACs and from the Chinese for some good long time. So when you put all that together, I can understand the resonance, the real concern that Benjamin Netanyahu has expressed time and again, with plenty of evidence that the Iranians are going in a direction that is not healthy for the region, much less for the world. Same thing with Kim Jong-un, who, of course, here recently has agreed to likely sell munitions that the Russians can't seem to produce in sufficient quantities to sustain the war in Ukraine, 155 artillery rounds, some anti-tank munitions. So when you put these things together and you see that we're being attacked left and right through their cyber armies, which are very effective, those in Russia, those in China, North Korea, and elsewhere, and when you consider that they're going after not only our money, but they're also going after to influence the voting in this country through a variety of mechanisms, some of which are cyber, some of which are direct interference through their proxies. These are issues of grave concern, and I would hope that the American public, left and right, would recognize that this great nation that we have is salvageable if we only begin to wake up to the reality as to what these people are doing. And party neutral here, let's think of the best interest of America. And I would hope that we begin to see that and crystal clear.
Well, I would agree with you. Even if we were to move more, as you suggested, into pluralism, John Naisbitt in his book Megatrends, I don't know, some 25 plus
Mhm.
years ago, said that the two-party system was like two dinosaurs mating. I'll never forget that. And I keep thinking, okay, when is the when is the end of this two-party system? Because in a sense, it's kind of morphed into a uniparty, so to speak. But we need a divergence of view. But at the end of the day, we need to come together united on what we're trying to accomplish here. Maybe from different directions, that's okay. But I think we need to agree on the principal issue of what being an American is all about. Is that fair to say?
No, I think that's fair to say. I mentioned James Madison when he was in the White House. Dolly Madison was very effective at bringing people from both of the major political parties into the White House. And the comment was that no one knew who a party affiliation was the other, because that wasn't the thing that they tried to accomplish. They wanted people to talk. They wanted people to try to get civil and get along, not like Aaron Burr and Hamilton.
Hamilton, yes.
Match in 1804, and Hamilton bit the dust. That's not how to settle differences. We need to settle our differences by learning how to make rational arguments without getting heated. That's one of the things that Madison said. Rhetoric, we don't teach that in school anymore. You shouldn't have to get red in the face in order to make your point. And certainly you don't need to shoot your
opponent.
But back in, what was it, 1857, I think it was, that Sumner, a senator out of Massachusetts, was making a speech against slavery in the Senate floor, and he attacked verbally a Southern senator from South Carolina. And the very next day, the nephew of that Southern senator came over to the Senate chamber and beat almost to death with a cane Sumner. And that was the atmosphere in which our Congress was in 1858. No wonder, 2 years later, we couldn't decide, on a Democratic candidate for both the North and the South, much less a Republican. And so we had these split ballots, and, Lincoln walks into the White House, on 36% of the total Northern vote. Right. So, things just don't make sense. We don't need that in this country. What we need to do is find out how to be civil. We need to think about the best interest and the preservation of civil liberties. And we need to get our economy going in the right direction and allow people to take care of themselves, their families, and educate their children in ways that they want to.
Well, as you point out, what happened in 1857, Bob, that should have been a clear indicator that we were letting loose of our moral anchorings. Morality holds us to a certain discipline and level of civility. You cast off morality, all goes. Everything goes, right?
Oh, it certainly does. And unfortunately, I think that, this goes back to the influence of the church within the American population. And we've seen a rather precipitous decline in not only affiliation with a faith community, but also participation in that faith community. You may say you're, quote, a Christian, but you may never go to church. So it's more of an ethnic association of sorts, of affiliation.
Right, exactly.
And so, where do you get your morals? Are you getting your morals from watching TV? Are you getting your morals from, some local hangout place? Or are you getting your morals from your family that is invested in your local church or synagogue or whatever, so that you have some modicum of direction that's outside of yourself, that says what's right and wrong, and certainly what's in the best interest of my family, my community, and my nation.
Well, Bob, you bring up a great point here, and that is that there's a call to America, you know, in much as you've done and what you've written about as being that watchman on the wall, is that America needs a renewal. We need a revival to where we turn our hearts away from our own selfishness and turn it toward God and ask for God to forgive us. I mean, clearly in 2 Chronicles 7:14, God gives us the specifics, and it starts with people who are called by his name. As you mentioned, people may say they're a Christian, but are you called by his name? And if you are called by his name and you've had enough of this silliness that's happening in our country, and you can look and see the forecast and the trajectory that this country is on and what kind of America we're turning over to our kids and our grandkids. And if that doesn't disturb you enough to turn from your wicked ways, then heaven help us.
Yeah, absolutely, Bill. You know, we look around and we see, you know, people taking over our schools and trying to teach our children, you know, that girls can be boys and boys can be girls. The whole idea of ontology is thrown out the window.
Yeah.
You know, they try to teach things that, you know, are like the parents that go to school boards and read out of, you know, books that are taken from the local library, and the school boards just object to hearing that trash. Yeah. And yet that's what they've allowed in our schools. Even the stuff on our media, our television, you know, it used to be Leave It to Beaver and Father Knows Best, but today it's just rancid stuff that is value programming our children in ways that, you know, we could have only have had nightmares about years ago. So we find that the culture is diminished us as people. It's kind of seared our conscience to a large degree. So we act in ways, unfortunately, that is more accepting to what the leftists are pushing rather than what our founders would have pushed when they were alive, you know, 250 years ago. So these are issues of grave consequence. It's certainly my prayer that, you know, people of faith would not feign. They would be outspoken about what is right and what's wrong. They won't, you know, cave to the abuse of the left, and certainly become instruments, as some on the left are, arguably, of proxies of Satan and his demonic armies, or those that have been recruited in ways that represent the evil that he perpetrates. So I believe that it's a very real dimension here, and that's why when I wrote about Deeper State, I talked about the spiritual ishes. And today, when I talk about Divided We Stand, you know, I have a couple of chapters, and they're talking about, you know, how Satan enticed Jesus himself on, and then of course Jesus, you know, said, "Away with you." He didn't want the world. He didn't want all the treasures. He wanted obedience to God, and yet, you know, of course, that's exactly what Satan doesn't want. He wanted obedience to him.
Exactly.
And we find that it played out today in the world in which we live, where, you know, so much of the evil perpetrators out there that are behind some of these radical policies are pushing an agenda that is incredibly evil and not in our overall best interest.
Well, without a doubt, and as you recall in that moment there, you know, when Jesus was being tempted, he demonstrated to us what the sword of the Spirit looks like. It was the word of God that he used against Satan. And what could Satan do? He tried 2 other times, a total of 3 times, to entice Christ. But each time Jesus responded with, you know, the sword of the Spirit, which is very effective. And so it's a clear definition of what is available to us, as you say, because, you know, darkness is coming over the land. And as light bearers, as people of faith, we are the ones that can, you know, bring the light of God to the dark corners of the world, can we not?
Absolutely. You know, I've said many times that because of my background in Washington, I think I may have mentioned to you that the darkness of Washington, unless you're a deep insider, you don't appreciate, you know, that evil is attracted to power. Right. And Washington, of course, is known for power. You know, years ago, my own mother was the personal assistant to Jean Dixon, which was the psychic that had great access into the White House, and worked with many of the first ladies and senior officials in government for years. So if our senior government people were tethered to psychics and trying to have these extra outside of their body experiences and so forth, and that's what they were doing, that occultic sort of direction, I think, is something that is very present in Washington. I've come across in my years in Washington a lot of people that self-identify as witches, and I've called that out in some of the media. Of course, they get thoroughly castigated, ridiculed for that. But they were the ones that told me about it. And so when I describe Washington, I say there's like a dark cloud that seems to pervade over the entire assembly of government officials. And so when you have to understand that it's not just the administrative state that's doing the beckoning of some of the leftists, but it's also the evilness that it's well established itself in Washington. As a direct result, we have some very bad policy, some very bad leadership, and yet it just has sunk its teeth to keep a tight rein over that power, because Satan has no intention of relinquishing power to God. And yet godly people not only should be praying, but they should be bold in declaring the truth of Christ in a fallen world. And that's what we are. We're here until God calls us home. And until that time, let's be persistent in being light on the hill, being salt to, in some cases, wounds that need healing.
Exactly. Well, as you say, Bob, and as we know, the way we're designed, we're going to worship something. And either we're going to worship the legitimate or the counterfeit. That's right. What you have shared with us is consistent with others have shared who have been there in the belly of the beast, is that there is darkness there in these institutions. Well, how can we expect any kind of righteousness to come out of darkness?
Well, it is hard, but persistence, and of course, to a certain degree, those that are light are going to be attacked. I think of when I was at the Family Research Council years ago, we were constantly under attack, and in fact, the Southern Poverty Law Center inspired someone a number of years ago to go in and shoot up with a weapon and wounded a friend of mine who was a security guard at the front desk. So these issues have grave consequences, and it's not just the policy, but it's how they treat people and who really is in charge. I think of the situation. I have a good friend of mine, Charlie Cooper. He was a lieutenant general, but when he was a very young officer, he was the aide to the chief of naval operations back in 1965, I think it was. And Charlie escorted the chief and the other chiefs of the services in to meet with LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, the president at the time. And they were trying to tell the president, we need to get out of Vietnam. And at the time, we had less than 100,000 soldiers there. Right. And LBJ, Charlie went in with these four-star flag officers and the president, and he was the only one there. He was holding the map, and they were saying, we don't need to do this anymore, Mr. President. And so what happened? LBJ, in his political way of looking at the world, cursed them out, kicked them out of office, and directed McNamara to radically increase the number of troops we sent over there. And so years later, in 1975, we finally pulled out, but it wasn't until we lost 58,000 Americans and, well over 100,000 were wounded and, arguably almost $1 trillion spent. So, that's darkness as far as I'm concerned. The motivations of some politicians does not fit the image that many of us want for America, much less does it represent the values that our founders gave us.
Exactly. Yeah, without a doubt. Robert Maginnis has been our guest, former Army Lieutenant Colonel, author of the book, Divided We Stand, the Globalist Scheme for a One World Government. Robert, we've got about a minute left here. I'm going to let you summarize and remind everybody how they can get their hands on your book.
Well, Divided We Stand is available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, certainly any place you can buy books. It's even my publisher, Defender Publishing. And so I'd encourage people to pray about it, perhaps go and buy a copy. See, the history of division that goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 3, when Adam and Eve were tempted by the great divider, Satan himself. And we've seen divisions played out all the way up to the present time. It's the key tool of the leftists today. They're dividing us on race, on gender, on money issues, on politics. We need to do away with division as best as we can because it's in our mutual best interest. As James Madison said, we have to somehow find an accommodation for civility in our culture. And I think if we do that, then our nation can be, resurrected. Well,
Bob, I think we've done it before. And the fact that we've done it before gives us encouragement that we can do it again. So, by God's grace and mercy, may it be so. Bob Maginnis, thank you so much for being with us. I appreciate you.
Thank you, Bill.
Our thanks to Bob Maginnis for being with us. For more information and to be a part of this mighty movement to return to God and to save our country, go to BillMartinezShow.com. May God bless you and keep you and make his face shine upon you. And may he be gracious unto you and give you peace. Thank you so much for being with us. God bless. Take care.